Week 1 of the preseason is in the books, and boy, were there some surprises. Today, we dive into player usage to see what we can learn for fantasy football on the Fantasy First Down. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. We've had the first week of preseason, and there have been quite a few surprises when it comes to depth chart usage and things like that. A lot of players that were expecting to be fantasy relevant this season, it's not looking great for them early on. So I'm going to break down every single game of the preseason. I'm going to talk about what we learned for fantasy football and how it's going to impact your upcoming drafts. If you haven't already, it'd be great if you'd like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down. That's where I post all my rankings first. You can also go over to Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. And you can check out my website, ffdfantasyfootball.com. That's got my redraft, dynasty, and rookie rankings over there, plus a list of all the articles that I write over for Razball as well. Let's get into it. Now, honestly, breaking down 16 preseason games takes a lot of time, and I frankly just didn't have time to do a proper graphic up. So this is what we're getting instead. This is basically the depth chart for each of the teams involved in the preseason game. Essentially, I put down whether they played or not, and if they played, what stats they got. So for the quarterback, their completions, their yards, their touchdown intercepts ratio. For running backs, it's obviously touches and then yards and then touchdowns. And if they did receiving work, the same thing. Obviously, for wide receivers and tight ends, it's receptions, yards, touchdowns. And obviously, because it's preseason, very run heavy, so it is mostly the running backs that are getting most of the work. Also, big shout out to a couple of the sites that put a lot of the data out for this. Obviously, Nathan Yankee does a lot of work around snap counts and things like that, and I do go to his stuff and look at a couple of his snap counts. So shout out to him. Also shout out, obviously, to the guys over at places like Pro Football Reference, who puts a lot of data out as well. I use them a lot, and obviously Fantasy Pros, where I do some work over there as well. And you also need to head over to Razball because they've got some awesome stats that you can get both in season and preseason as well. So make sure you're going and looking out for that sort of data too. Now we're going to start things off with the Giants against the Lions. Nothing particularly shocking happened here. The Giants rested most of their starters, and I think probably the biggest surprise there was that they rested Darius Slayton. This seemed like a weird choice to me, and maybe Wan'Dale Robinson a little bit surprising. I think we both expected them to both start. I thought potentially Slayton might start, but I guess they figured they're already starting Neighbors out wide, and they probably want to see Jalen Hyatt. So probably don't need to see Darius Slayton, but it does suggest that at the moment, Slayton's ahead of Hyatt. So for those Jalen Hyatt truthers out there, I feel like you might be waiting a little bit longer, even though I do think there is a chance over the course of the season he'll take over. Of course, we also saw that Malik Neighbors got a random ankle injury pop up just in the last day or two. I don't think that's going to be a massive concern. I think he's going to be okay. He didn't play much in the preseason, mostly played out wide, which isn't really ideal. I feel like he was best in college in the slot, and I feel like he would be more productive there in the NFL. We see a lot of players who have high fantasy finishes, especially in PPR, at least get a significant amount of time in the slot. It might be that Wan'Dale Robinson gets some rests and some snaps off, and you see both Slayton and Hyatt out wide, and that's when you see Neighbors come to the slot. So it's possible we'll see that, but in this preseason game, it was Isaiah McKenzie working from the slot. We didn't really see Neighbors go there a lot, so not really sure exactly what they said. It's probably not a big positive for him. I think the biggest running back news was firstly that Singletary missed out altogether, which suggests what we already knew. He's the number one running back. But Tyrone Tracy was the clear number two, and it wasn't even particularly close. He got all the touches with the starters. Obviously, the starters didn't last terribly long because Drew Lock got injured. But we at least know that Tracy is going to be the guy, at least short term, as the backup. Now, can he take over from Devin Singletary? Well, given Singletary probably has the weakest hold of many of the running backs going about, I think this makes Tracy a reasonably valuable backup, at least long-term. I think possibly in Dynasty, it increases his value more because I do think he has a chance of taking over a more permanent role. But I think even if he gets into the starting role, how much value is there going to be in getting the Giant running back? I mean, think about where you're drafting Devin Singletary. You're probably getting him in the 7th or 8th round in some drafts. So that means if you're getting his backup, you're not getting the starter, and you have a guy who's only getting 7th or 8th round value. I don't know that that's really worthwhile in a redraft league. I think that Tracy has more value long term. Now, for the tight ends, I know a lot of people have been high on Theo Johnson ever since Darren Waller retired. Ultimately, in this game, it seemed to be a bit of a committee situation. They kind of went drive to drive. Johnson was doing a lot of the 11 personnel work, but you saw Bellinger getting together with Manhurts on 12 personnel. That's courtesy of PFF. Eventually, we saw Bellinger getting some 11 personnel snaps as well. It was all a little bit of a mess. I watched parts of that game, and it just didn't seem to be particularly clear which of those tight ends they were really going to lean on. I think that's going to be an ugly committee, and it's one I'm going to be avoiding. Meanwhile, for the Lions, nothing massively interesting happened here. They rested the vast majority of their starters. I think it's pretty significant that they rested Khalif Raymond. I think it's pretty clear-cut that he is going to be their third wide receiver. That's not a particularly valuable role for the Lions. Heck, the second wide receiver isn't particularly valuable, and we know that's Jamison Williams. He's going, 50th wide receiver overall or something like that. So I don't know that you're going to get a lot of value out of Raymond. He's probably more of a best ball guy because he is going to have some boom weeks. I was a little bit surprised to see Nate Sudfeld start. I thought after they spent quite a lot to get Hendon Hooker as their backup, they might actually use him as the backup. It's possible he just isn't quite at that place yet, and they're still going to keep him on the roster. So it'll be interesting to see what happens there. Craig Reynolds, unsurprisingly, still the backup to Gibbs and Montgomery, but we've seen in the past when Gibbs or Montgomery gets injured, it's not like Reynolds slides into that exact role. He becomes a true backup, and either Gibbs or Montgomery becomes the really valuable guy. I think it was particularly interesting that Gibbs got injured recently. They're expecting him to be back at the start of the season, but I wouldn't be surprised if David Montgomery starts going a little bit earlier in drafts, especially because it is possible that Gibbs has that injury linger into the season that affects his workload. For the tight end, Sam Laporta, still one of the best tight ends in the game. One of the big surprises for me is that Antoine Green was the starter for the Lions. He and Darius Fountain started out wide for them in this game. And then they waived Green. Very weird decision. Obviously, they didn't like what they saw there. So things are very messy behind the top two, realistically. I think Raymond's pretty set as the number 3. Okay, let's move on to the Panthers and the Patriots. Panthers also rested a lot of players. We essentially didn't see their top 4 running backs. We didn't see their first couple of quarterbacks. I think Andy Dalton might technically be injured, even though I've got him down as rested. We didn't see the top 2 or 3 wide receivers, depending on where Xavier Legette goes. Didn't see a couple of their tight ends because they are injured. So it really was a weak Panthers lineup that we saw, especially on offense. Jack Plummer was running it, and it wasn't pretty. What's happening in the running back room? We don't know. Chuba Hubbard's going to be the main guy. We don't know when Jonathan Brooks is going to be back, but it doesn't look like it will be at least about a month into the season. I think that's going to be very ugly, and I'll be avoiding both of those guys. I've seen a lot of people drafting Hubbard late. That really only makes sense if you want to use him in the first 2 or 3 weeks of the season, because he's going to completely lose his value by week 4 or 5 when you actually need someone for bye week. So for me, you're only taking Hubbard if you've gone 0 RB and you actually want to start him in those first few weeks. Interesting, they rested Blackshear as well. I think he's probably the number 4, but will initially be number 3. I think he'll probably do a lot of kick return work, and maybe just because they're resting every other starter, they rested him as well. It's a bit surprising that Jonathan Mingo started. I think possibly it's just because they didn't have enough healthy wide receivers that they could use. They're already resting Johnson and Thielen, who we know are starters. Don't really know exactly where Legette fits in there. I think it's going to be Legette versus Mingo, and it's going to be messy early on. But I expect Legette has the talent to take over. For the tight ends, we saw Jatavian Sanders, but Tremble and Thomas are out injured, so that doesn't actually tell us where they sit in the depth chart. I think that's another situation like the Giants where it's going to be a bit of a committee situation. You just want to avoid it altogether. Now, there are no real surprises with the Patriots. It looks like a pretty mediocre passing offense. They couldn't really get much going. Jacoby Brissett obviously started. Drake May came in for a little bit, but it was mostly Bailey Zappi, and we saw some Joe Milton as well. I do think that Brissett's going to be the starter for the vast majority of the season. Drake May might come in at some point in time once they're out of playoff contention. For the running backs, it was interesting. Ramondre Stevenson played essentially the whole first drive. Then we saw Antonio Gibson. Antonio Gibson was being used in the exact Ramondre Stevenson role, from what I could tell. Kevin Harris seemed to come in just slightly ahead of Jermichael Hasty, but then they seem to kind of be used interchangeably. I don't know what would happen if Stevenson goes down. I think probably you see Gibson get a pretty heavy load, and that's going to make him a valuable backup, because it's not clear that Harris or Hasty is necessarily the next guy in there, and there'd be a committee situation. So I feel like you're only going to see Harris or Hasty if both Stevenson and Gibson goes down. That makes Gibson a pretty valuable backup. For the wide receivers, Kendrick Bourne's still injured. Who knows whether he'll be back at the start of the season. Pop Douglas is injured. But the interesting thing is, despite both of those guys being out, we didn't see Jalen Polk with the first team at all. Now, to be fair, first team didn't play for very long, but we saw KJ Osborne starting, and I feel like he is probably going to be the starter in week 1. We saw Tyquan Thornton in there. I find it hard to believe he's going to be starting. And Juju Smith-Schuster was in there as well as a starter. That seems weird to me. They've only got a limited amount of wide receiver spots. They've already got Bourne. They've already got Douglas. They've got Osborne. They've got to keep Polk and Baker. Plus, they've got special team guys as well. So Jalen Reagor's a chance, even though he came in later on. But realistically, we've seen outside in their training camp stuff that Jalen Polk's been running with the ones a lot. So it does feel to me like this is more of a rookie situation, the rookie being further down the depth chart simply because they're a rookie. And that Polk will actually start, but it wouldn't surprise me if we don't see Bourne in week 1 and we see Polk and Osborne working together with Douglas in week 1 until Bourne gets back, and then Bourne taking over from Osborne, who'll become the backup, I suspect. Javon Baker has been a little bit of a dynasty darling. I don't get it at all. I don't know what you guys are seeing. He was the wide receiver 8 or 9 or something like that. He'll make the roster, but I don't see a situation where you're going to see him being fantasy relevant this season. That would really surprise me. For the tight ends, Hunter Henry's the guy. Austin Hooper, we know, can be a reasonable backup. It's just how many snaps he takes from Henry. Hopefully it's not too many, but we have seen in the past that he is capable of getting out there on all 3 downs, and that can make him a dangerous backup to have. Now, the Texans and the Steelers did actually start their starters, and that made this a little bit more of a fun game to start, even though it wasn't necessarily for very long in the case of the Texans. We saw CJ Stroud playing a drive, kind of at a half. And he looked okay. He looked like CJ Stroud. He threw a touchdown to Tank Dell. It wasn't anything particularly special. Dell was reasonably open. Dell beat a man. Dell scored a touchdown. Realistically, we know Stroud's the guy. Davis Mills will remain the backup. Tim Boyle's there as well, just to add some experience. So nothing interesting there. For the running backs, Joe Mixon's injured. But I think the most interesting thing was that Damian Pierce played that whole drive with the starters. So realistically, I think that Pierce is the main guy. I'm not sure exactly what's happening with the backups. They don't seem to have a clear third down back at the moment. I think if it's going to be anyone, it will be a Gunbowale. Worth noting that Cam Akers is below Jawar Jordan, the 6th-round rookie as well. Whether it stays that way or not, because he only come in recently, I'm not sure. But I do think we're going to find that Cam Akers is no longer fantasy relevant in general. For the wide receivers, I think the biggest shock here was Stephon Diggs played in the slot. I'm not necessarily sure that I expected that to be the case the whole time. I thought they might cycle and potentially they will into the season. But if that's the case, and especially because Diggs was playing in all in 12 personnel as well, that's going to really help Stephon Diggs, and it's going to hurt Tank Dell. I do feel like that moves Diggs up a little bit in my rankings and moves Dell down a little bit. You can only really read so much into essentially one drive. Noah Brown's injured at the moment. I don't think he's going to affect that top 3, but I think he probably slides in ahead of Robert Woods, who actually was out there for a surprising amount of time for a veteran. And then obviously John Mechie slides in after that as well. He is probably the next guy up, but realistically not going to get down to number 6 unless they have injuries like last season. Dalton Schultz played a little bit, but wasn't heavily involved. The real surprise was that Cade Stover came out, even on that first drive when CJ Stroud was out there. I do think potentially that's got something to do with Brevin Jordan and Tegan Kitoriano both being injured. I think possibly if those guys weren't injured, then we wouldn't have seen those guys out there as much. We certainly wouldn't have seen Stover as early. But Stover versus Jordan is going to be an interesting battle because I think realistically we might see that eventually they have to move on for Schultz. And I think that Stover might be the guy they're thinking of long-term, given what they gave up to get him. For the Steelers, obviously, Russell Wilson remains injured. Justin Fields looked okay. Realistically, this offense moved pretty well. Did have some sack issues, but for the most part was pretty solid. Certainly accurate with his passing, which is good to see. But I do think that Wilson is still the clear starter. There has been a lot of buzz going on at the moment of the Steelers potentially trying to trade for Brandon Ayuk. Apparently there's a deal potentially in place, but Ayuk's hoping to do a deal with the 49ers, and that's looking significantly more likely, which is an interesting progression. But it also suggests that the Steelers do think that they need someone else in there at wide receiver. And realistically, they do. The surprise is that we didn't really see a lot of Roman Wilson. Obviously, he didn't play in this game. He was injured, but it does seem to me that probably Van Jefferson's ahead of him anyway. Jefferson played pretty much every snap with the starters as an outside receivers. Calvin Austin is the slot guy. Because they do tend to use a reasonable amount of 2 tight end sets, this is obviously Arthur Smith bringing in what he did with the Falcons. that's going to hurt Austin. We saw the same thing happen at Atlanta. That third wide receiver spot is less valuable. So I was really hopeful for Austin coming in. I thought potentially he could be the wide receiver 2 here, and that would give him some value. I feel like he's just not going to have enough snaps to be valuable, even though I do think he'll be useful when he's out there. George Pickens is the clear number 1. Jefferson, even though he's going to be out there the whole time, is not useful for fantasy, and there's nothing below those guys behind Wilson, and we haven't seen much from him. For the running backs, Najee Harris and Jalen Warren, it was just exactly what we've always seen for them. Nothing particularly interesting happened. Cordero Patterson is probably the number 3, but he was injured, so we didn't actually see that confirmed. I don't think it's going to be Jonathan Ward, even though he did kind of look okay. For the tight ends, the most concerning thing is how they cycled them. They've got 2 good blocking tight ends in Darnell Washington and Michael Pruitt, who Arthur Smith just brings with him everywhere. He's been at the Titans, he's been at the Falcons, and now he's come to the Steelers. I feel like they're going to take way too many touches away from Pat Freiermuth, who I was really hopeful for going into this season, but the whole Arthur Smith situation is really scary, and he's going to be dropping down my rankings a lot after this game. Also interesting to see that Connor Hayward was well behind those guys. He's basically the Freiermuth replacement. So you don't want Washington or Pruitt, even though they're going to be out there. They're there as blockers. We knew that about Darnell Washington when he was drafted. That remains the case. Freiermuth's the receiving back. Hayward would take over from him if you're injured. Freiermuth is scaring me a lot. Dolphins against the Falcons. We saw the Dolphins rest a lot of players. They rested the vast majority of their starters and a whole heap of guys that aren't particularly starters. I'm not sure exactly what was going on with a lot of their wide receivers. Some of them were kind of pseudo-injured. They were kind of in non-contact jerseys at times. They weren't really listed as injured. It was a little bit messy, so it's hard to tell exactly who was injured and who was rested. But suffice to say, they started a very weak lineup, as you can see by how many guys just weren't playing. Skylar Thompson was surprisingly ahead of Mike White, which has surprised a lot of people who have been taking Mike White as a backup. But I think that Thompson may well be ahead of him. I think they just see him as someone who offers a little bit more upside, who can kind of grow a little bit more. But realistically, if Tua's not playing, the Dolphins are in big trouble anyway. They rested Mostert and Achane, which isn't surprising. We saw at this time of the season last year that Achane was well down the depth chart. He was behind Wilson and Ahmed. And that's exactly where Jalen Wright is at the moment. Jalen Wright was well behind Jeff Wilson. I think he probably would have been behind Ahmed. That's where he's been running in training camp. But I think realistically, we're going to see that he slowly rises up. I can't imagine they keep both Wilson and Ahmed in addition to Mostert and Achane and Wright. I feel like they probably keep 4 of them. And I think Ahmed's probably the guy who misses out. So that's why I've got Wright listed higher. Wright actually looked pretty good, but it's easy to look good in this offense. Jeff Wilson did not particularly. So I feel like Wright's going to pretty easily pass him. What impact he's actually going to have, I think possibly unless Mostert gets injured, you're probably still not going to see a lot of Jalen Wright. He's not someone I'm going out of my way to get in fantasy. In fact, I'll probably be avoiding all of these runners except maybe Mostert, who still seems to be going way too late for the running back 3 last season in a situation where they haven't suggested anything's going to change. The wide receiver room's a little bit messy. Tyreek Hill is obviously being rested as a vet. Jalen Waddle's got a little bit of an injury issue, but probably wouldn't have played anyway. Odell Beckham Jr. also injured, but I think he is the wide receiver 3. But I think he probably splits touches with Braxton Berrios, who will spend plenty of time in the slot. What happens after that doesn't really matter because realistically, we know that this offense runs through the running backs and 2 wide receivers, and that's it. For the tight ends, both Jonnu Smith and Durham Smythe got rested. I think that Smith is probably the starter, but until we actually see that, I'm a little bit nervous about how that's going to look. For the Falcons, I should say, who the Dolphins are playing against, they did rest quite a few starters, but I think it was the usage that was most interesting thing and kind of the personnel groupings they used. They used a lot of 11 personnel, which is totally unsurprising given we're expecting to see that Zach Robinson Rams style offense. And that means a lot of 11 personnel. Now, who does that mean? Well, obviously London and Mooney were out for this game, but interestingly, Ray McLeod was also rested with Rondale Moore out for the season with an ACL injury. That is inevitable now. I think McLeod was probably ahead anyway, but now that's definitely the case. And look at the guys they've got behind him. They're not exactly big names. Casey Washington's a rookie, and it's kind of surprising to see him this high. Kadarrell Hodge is mostly a blocking wide receiver. Chris Blair's not a big name either. So it is going to be London, Mooney, and McLeod. And based on how much 11 personnel they were using, I think that Ray McLeod is actually going to be someone you can start in deeper PPR leagues this year. So he's someone you can take in very late rounds. I think he could be surprisingly productive. We did see Michael Penix start. He looked okay. First game, you can't read into this too much, but he's clearly the starter there, even though he's playing with a whole heap of backups. For their running backs, I mean, it's clearly Bijan and then Tyler Algier, who is a good handcuff. Carlos Washington and Jason McClellan, they're kind of battling it out for that third spot. They were kind of used a little bit interchangeably. McClellan probably looked the better of the two. Avery Williams is still there, and that's notable because I think they might still continue using him on third and very long because he does tend to be their third down long receiving back. And based on what we saw in this game, I think that probably remains the case. For the tight ends, Kyle Pitts obviously rested, but it's interesting to see Charlie Warner rested as well. I think that means he's now clearly the backup, which last year was very valuable when it was Jonnu Smith. This year, not so much, I suspect. So will be interesting to see what we see out of this Falcons offense, but I think they could potentially be very good once we see all the starters back. Ravens against the Eagles, and the Ravens rested a heap of players as well. Lamar Jackson rested, which means we saw Josh Johnson ahead of the rookie Devin Leary. Nothing particularly interesting there. They didn't really throw the ball very much. They didn't have many players to throw it to because they rested their 3 starting wide receivers and their 2 starting tight ends. What's going on behind the wide receivers doesn't matter too much. Keith Kirkwood is a guy that a lot of people feel fondly towards after he was badly injured in a bad mistake by his teammate. Tylan Wallace is obviously still hanging around there. I think the biggest surprise was that Tez Walker was so far down. Got him listed as 6 there. He's actually even lower than that. But I think realistically, he belongs in the same range as Kirkwood and Wallace. I think he's going to make the roster, which means he should be at least listed as a top 6 wide receiver. At tight end, Andrews and Likely are still the main 2 guys. Cole is probably nominally the number 3, but it doesn't matter too much. The running backs are interesting. Henry was rested, but surprisingly, Justice Hill was rested as well. I think the primary reason for that is that Keaton Mitchell was badly injured. He is out for the season with a knee injury, and that means that Hill becomes the number 2. But it also opens up space for Rasheen Ali, who I think is probably a Derrick Henry-like replacement. Now, how valuable he is, we'll have to wait and see. But he was running behind Owen Wright in this game, who's a no-name former undrafted free agent who realistically it was surprising to see him on the field that early at all. So we'll have to wait and see what happens in that situation. But I still think Ali's the backup to own if you want to own any backup. I think probably you just don't want to own a backup at all in this Ravens situation. For the Eagles, they also rested their main starters. I'm a bit surprised to see Paris Campbell rested. He has battled some injury issues, so I think that might have something to do with that. Kenny Pickett was the backup that started, and I think there's no surprise there, but they did struggle to pass the ball a little bit. I think the biggest surprise was at running back, Kenneth Gainwell starting over Will Shipley. I guess it's not so much of a surprise. I was hoping to see at least a little bit of a committee situation with Gainwell and Shipley. That would suggest they're going to turn it over to Shipley a little bit more, but I do think inevitably Shipley probably becomes the number 2 guy. I do think ultimately, though, if Barkley goes down, it becomes a committee, and that means you don't really want either of those backups. Lou Nichols is the next guy up. He's obviously someone you're not interested in either. For the wide receivers, I mean, Johnny Wilson's the big name that jumps out there. It was a little bit surprising to see him so far over Aeneas Smith, who was drafted before him by the Eagles this year. I think Smith was 5th round, Wilson was 6th round. Wilson's a very different style player. He's kind of like that big-bodied player, has some separation issues, but he's obviously making that work. They had him playing opposite speedster and former top 10 pick, John Ross, who's now back and around. Biggest surprise for me is that Brendan Covey started and played most of his time in the slot. I don't see him actually being involved. He's more of a special teams guy. But I do think that Johnny Wilson is someone that in deeper dynasty leagues you might have a look at, because it wouldn't be surprising to see him go past Paris Campbell, who was inactive at times for the Giants last year, even though the Giants were struggling for wide receivers. Nothing interesting happening at tight end except potentially that Grant Calcaterra was playing ahead of CJ Uzoma, who is starting to age out a little bit. The Jets played the Commanders, and we still didn't see Aaron Rodgers. No surprise there. We also didn't see Breece Hall, most of the wide receivers. I think Malik Taylor might have had some injury issues, but the others are the starters. Jeremy Ruckert also having some injury issues, but he may not have started either. I think the biggest takeaway here is probably, firstly, that they couldn't move the ball through the air. And secondly, that Braylon Allen looked amazing, and he is the clear backup to Breece Hall. And that shouldn't be a surprise, because I have been saying that for literally months. Braylon Allen is going to be one of the best handcuffs in fantasy football. If you get a Breece Hall injury, Braylon Allen is going to win you your title. He is going to be a top 12 running back, because he will take every snap. He was so clearly the number 1 guy in this game with no Hall there, and he looked really good. He's someone who can work as a receiving back. He's a fantastic runner. He's big. He can work on the goal line. Love Braylon Allen. This is a great situation for him. The other rookie, Malaki Corley, he did have some struggles. He did start, did some work from the slot, but Xavier Gibson seems to be the guy that's going to actually work there during the season. For the Commanders, Jaden Daniels got the start, which is fantastic news for all you Jaden Daniels fans. I think we expected that, even though some teams will do that thing where they make the starter rest just to kind of prove a point. We saw with Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler that it was the committee situation we all dread. Robinson was used a little bit more on early downs, Eckler a little bit more on passing downs, but it really was being used as a committee. How that starts to look as the season goes on remains the question. I feel like when Jaden Daniels, a rushing quarterback, is your quarterback, you probably want Brian Robinson in that situation because he's going to get more of the rushing work. There is going to be less receiving work. The biggest surprise for me was that Jeremy McNichols was running ahead of Chris Rodriguez, who was the clear number 3 last year. So I'm not really sure what's going on there, but you don't really want either of those guys anyway. They did start all of their starters except Zach Ertz. They rested a lot of the defensive guys, but most of the offensive starters started. We saw Terry McLaurin out there, but the biggest surprise was Jahan Dotson working in the slot. I think potentially we thought maybe that would be Luke McCaffrey, but McCaffrey was way down. De'Ami Brown was starting, and we saw Dotson working from the slot, and he's played in the slot quite a long way through the game. He was still out there in the slot when Jeff Driscoll was out there as the third quarterback. So I don't know if they were getting more exposure there or what the plan was, but I found that very interesting. They did eventually bring in guys like Zacchaeus and Tinsley, and eventually McCaffrey came out as well. It could be that McCaffrey is just getting that rookie punishment, which happens often where the rookies just have to wait and eventually they get in there. Zach Ertz was rested, and it was a little bit confusing exactly what was going on. I believe it was Ben Sinnott out there starting, although Nathan Yankee's numbers suggested otherwise, but to me it looked like Sinnott. John Bates is mainly a blocking guy, and Cole Turner's after that. So I would expect that Sinnott will be the guy who is challenging Zach Ertz. I feel like they're probably going to start Ertz, and then Sinnott slowly starts to take over. Probably don't want either of those guys for fantasy either. Bills against the Bears. We saw the Bills starters for a while. They didn't really look fantastic, but they weren't really trying anything particularly interesting. Josh Allen did his usual thing for a little while. They ran the ball quite a lot. It was James Cook a lot initially. Ray Davis was the clear backup, and he's another guy I've been talking about a lot. But Ty Johnson didn't play, and I can't find anything about him being injured, but I don't know why they'd rest him when they started all the other starters. So I don't understand what's going on with Ty Johnson there. I expected him to be kind of like the third and long back. So I'm not really sure why he didn't play. It seems that Darrington Evans is ahead of Frank Gore Jr., but neither of those guys is interesting. Ray Davis is the clear backup, and he was being used, I wouldn't say interchangeably with James Cook. Cook was the clear starter, but we did see him kind of coming in while the starters were still kind of out there a little bit. So Cook will be the number one guy, but Davis is going to be another valuable handcuff. He and Braylon Allen are my favorites. I really like Ray Davis this year if we get a James Cook injury, and wouldn't surprise me if he digs into Cook's touches anyway if he starts to look good. For the wide receivers, it was very interesting. Keon Coleman was the clear outside guy. And then kind of Curtis Samuel and Khalil Shakir were being used interchangeably. They weren't out there together too often because we kept seeing Kincaid and Knox both out there. And so when you're using 12 personnel, obviously you only have 2 wide receivers out there. And it was either Samuel or Shakir. Now, to be fair, they got a lot of touches when they were out there, but they were being used interchangeably a lot, and that's terrible for both of them. I thought it was possible that we'd see one of them win out, but if they kind of fighting for that same role, that's going to massively limit both of their value. So I will be dropping both Samuel and Shakir down my rankings a lot. Keon Coleman looked good. Especially his usage more so than his actual play. Those play look fine, but his usage looked really good. So I am confident that Coleman is the guy that you do want in fantasy, especially long-term. I love him in Dynasty. He was my number 4 wide receiver, but I think even in redraft, he's going to be productive. I had a lot of concern about Dalton Kincaid and how it'd be used with Dawson Knox coming back. We saw it looked pretty ugly last year, but they used a lot of 12 personnel. Kincaid was out there a lot, and I think that's going to really help him. So I will be considering moving him past the guys like Evan Ingram and David Njoku. I think particularly Ingram, who I'll talk about later on, is a guy that we might see Kincaid move past. Kincaid's still not someone I'm going out of my way to get, but I'm at least less scared about drafting him in those kind of like middle rounds. Meanwhile, for the Bears, and there was a lot going on, Caleb Williams made a couple of big plays, but Also made a couple of big misses. No surprises with his backups other than that. I think where it became really interesting was the usage of the running backs. DeAndre Swift had 2 touches. One was the first play of the game, and then he had this massive reception, but it was way later on. I'm not sure exactly how they were planning on using him, but they brought Khalil Herbert in. There was no Roshan Johnson, and then suddenly Travis Homer was the receiving back instead of DeAndre Swift. They planning on using Johnson as the receiving back? Is Homer the actual receiving back? Then Velus Jones, who's a wide receiver, suddenly became a running back, and they were using him as well. It was all a little bit of a mess, but I'm not sure exactly how they see this fitting in. This might be a little bit more of a committee than we want. We do know that teams don't like using DeAndre Swift all the time. I will be dropping Swift down my rankings quite considerably because this scares me a little bit. I still want to see a little bit more from week 2, but if you're drafting right now, I would not be taking DeAndre Swift at his current value. It's just a little bit too scary. For the wide receivers, DJ Moore was the clear guy. He was out there more than anybody else, no pun intended. Keenan Allen was playing from the slot, but he was also playing in 11 personnel. Rome Odunze was the third guy up, and we expected that. The interesting thing was that Webster kind of started to come in when Moore missed his snaps, and also for Allen, whereas Odunze wasn't that guy who was coming in on those snaps when we saw Moore off the field. So I'm not really sure if that means that if there's an injury to a Moore or an Allen, that Odunze snaps won't rise. I think they presumably would, but they just didn't want to get cute in the preseason. There's nothing much behind those top 3 guys, which is a bit of a concern for the Bears, but not a concern for fantasy because it means we're solidified in those 3 guys. Where we're not solidified is the tight ends. Cole Kmet was obviously a top 10 tight end last season, and now Jared Everett seems to be taking over, which is totally crazy to me. But they basically split snaps. They were used interchangeably. And if anything, Everett was getting more of the snaps. So I've got him listed higher. I don't want any part of either of this situation. This is really ugly. I don't understand why that's happening. I don't understand why they brought Everett in. I don't understand why they're using him ahead of Kmet, who's a good tight end. It makes no sense to me. So I would be avoiding the Bears tight ends entirely. Vikings v Raiders. I think the biggest concern here was not with the starters, who looked fine, but with JJ McCarthy, who, of course, has a pretty serious injury. He has done something to his meniscus. We don't know if it's fully torn or partially torn. If it's partial, he could be back by the start of the season. He's obviously not starting anyway. But if it's a full tear, he could be out for the whole season. And that would be big for Sam Darnold, especially in Superflex leagues. But realistically, if there's definitely no JJ McCarthy and Darnold is definitely starting all season, does he suddenly become a deep redraft option? I think he probably does. I think in this offense where he's going to be expected to pass the ball, Darnold might suddenly become someone of interest. So I would definitely keep your ear to the ground. And if we hear that McCarthy is out for the season, I think Darnold makes a big jump in my rankings. For the running backs, no Aaron Jones, he was rested. Ty Chandler was unsurprisingly the number 1. I was a bit surprised to see Nwangwu right behind him. I thought it might be McBride, but he ran behind Myles Gaskin, who we know they don't particularly love. So I think it's a bit of a mess behind the top 2 guys. At wide receiver, Justin Jefferson rested, no surprises there. Where it's really interesting is Brandon Powell against Jalen Naylor. Naylor replaced Jefferson, but I think that Powell's probably the slot guy. Now, obviously, Jefferson and Addison are going to spend some time in the slot, so it might be that we see Naylor come out there when that occurs, and then we see Powell in the slot when both Jefferson and Addison are working outside. That means that neither Powell nor Naylor is going to be productive for fantasy, and I think that kind of makes sense. I think we kind of knew that Jefferson and Addison would be the main 2 guys. Then there's just a whole heap of guys below that. At tight end, we know that TJ Hawkinson is going to miss the first month at least. I could miss half the season potentially. Johnny Munt, as I've been saying over and over and over again, is the receiving backup. Doesn't mean you want him, but he is the receiving backup. So I do feel like if you're desperate at tight end, you can get Munt. He is going to be the starter for the first few weeks of the season. Josh Oliver will be involved a little bit as well. They've also got Robert Tonyan, but he was well behind those 2 guys. I think Munt is the guy that you want if you're desperate at tight end for some reason. For the Raiders, it was Aiden O'Connell that got the first quarter, and then Gardner Minshew after that. They've gone to great pains to suggest that's not suggesting any order. I don't know that you can really believe that. I find it hard to believe it was like alphabetical order by first name or something like that. I feel like that suggests that O'Connell might be slightly ahead, but I don't really particularly want either of these quarterbacks, even though they both looked okay. For the running backs, Amir White did exactly what we expected. He was in there on first and second downs. The biggest surprise is that I thought that third down role was going to be a battle between Admir Abdullah and Dylan Laube. but it was Alexander Mattison who was out there on third down. So I don't really know what to make of that. We know that Mattison can be an okay receiving back, but when you've got two specialist receiving backs, it seems weird not to use them in the role that you brought them in for, especially Lauby. So that's a little bit concerning. It certainly drops Lauby's value for me from barely there to probably not there at all. But we'll see what happens in the second preseason game. Mattison doesn't magically suddenly have value, but it does suggest that potentially if White goes down, does Mattison suddenly get those early down touches and keep the receiving down touches? I think we've seen when he has the lead role, he's not particularly good, so I wouldn't be going out of my way to use him. At wide receiver, Devontae Adams rested. Jacoby Myers was used in the slot, which was where he was used when he was at the Pats, and that's good news. For him, I think his value gets a bit of a bump from there. I thought it might be Trey Tucker. Obviously, because they were using a lot of two tight end sets with Bowers and Mayer, that means that I think generally you're not going to see as much Trey Tucker, but we saw Tucker work from the outside in this game, and I feel like that's where we're going to see him moving forward, but he's only going to be out there in 11 personnel, which for the Raiders is not a particularly high percentage. For the tight ends, Brock Bowers is used everywhere, exactly as expected. I'm very, very, very high on Brock Bowers, as you know. I think he's going to be excellent. We did see a little bit of Michael Mayer. They used a lot of 12 personnel, and I don't think that Mayer is someone you particularly want for fantasy. He was being used as more of a traditional tight end. Bowers is the guy you want. I think he'll probably be moving into my top 10 after this, ahead of guys like Jake Ferguson, for example, because I do think the upside here is real. I feel like he's in a very similar situation to Dalton Kincaid. But in this case, I think they might use him even more effectively than the Bills use Kincaid. For the Browns against the Packers, Browns rested kind of a few players. They also had some injured players as well. But because Donta Foreman's been out, they had to use Jerome Ford as a starter, even though he wasn't used for too long. Pierre Strong came in eventually for him. That depth chart's a little bit of a mess, but I do think that probably Ford is the guy to own until we know that Nick Chubb's actually able to play. At quarterback, they used, I think, 4 different quarterbacks, but Winston was the main guy who started, but we know Deshaun Watson's realistically the guy. And I believe we're expecting to see him in the week 3 preseason game. At wide receiver, Cooper and Judy are clearly the starting guys. Elijah Moore's injured, but it does seem like I said last week, that Cedric Tillman is the number 3 guy. That was in my preseason news last week. So I believe that's going to remain the case. He's clearly ahead of Woods and Bell, but does seem to be ahead of Moore as well. At tight end, David Njoku is the clear starter, but Jordan Aikens seems to be in there as number 2, which is a little bit of a surprise. He's a good receiving tight end. Hopefully he doesn't take a dent into David Njoku's workload. For the Packers started most of their starters, but not for very long. They realistically only really played like 6 snaps, something along those lines. The biggest surprise is that Jordan Love threw a massive touchdown to Dontavian Wicks, who was out there for 1 snap. So it was a very weird situation where they started Watson and Dobbs on the outside and Reed in the slot. When they used 2 tight ends, Reed came off. And then suddenly Wicks came in for 1 snap, scored a long touchdown, and then that was it. And suddenly it was Grant DeBose, who wasn't even one of the many wide receivers like Melton, Heath, and Toure that we saw last year. He was the guy getting most of the action. He was out there on nearly every snap. We saw some Melton, we saw some Heath, we saw a little bit of Toure. It's a total mess. Absolute mess. I still think that Romeo Dobbs is going to be the other outside starter. This hurts Jaden Reed. I did think that we'd see him a lot more in non-11 personnel, so more in 12 personnel mostly. That didn't seem to be the case, but again, it was only like 6 snaps, so we don't know for sure. Running back usage was a bit weird as well. It was a drive of Josh Jacobs, a drive of AJ Dillon, 1 snap of Marshall Lloyd. I think he probably would have played out that drive. Then a heap of Emmanuel Wilson and everybody else. That doesn't mean that AJ Dillon is definitely ahead of Marshall Lloyd. That could just be that rookie punishment that I talked about earlier, but I don't know. It's not great. Lloyd wasn't out there for very long, and he was already injured. I mean, it's not a good sign. So I said 1 snap. It was a little bit more than that, but it was very much 1 drive at most. And Dillon was the drive ahead of him. So I don't know. I don't feel particularly great about that situation. Lloyd's done a hammy. We know that hammies are not great for running backs, especially when it's already been an issue. So I'm very nervous about Lloyd this season. I think he's someone that you probably want to avoid for redraft. I already wasn't very high on him, and now I'm even lower. For the tight ends, Luke Musgrave and Tucker Kraft are still in a battle. Kraft's injured, so we don't know exactly what is going to happen there. So I feel like you do want to hold on to Tucker Kraft in Dynasty for now just to see what happens. Bengals against the Bucs. The Bengals started their starters for a solid amount of time. It was a solid drive that led to a touchdown to T. Higgins in the end from Joe Burrow. Burrow's the clear number 1 ahead of Browning. For the running backs, I was hoping to learn a little bit more about Zach Moss versus Chase Brown, but Moss is injured, so it's clearly just Chase Brown. I think the biggest positive news is that we didn't see Travion Williams or Chris Evans being used on passing downs. They just used Chase Brown there. That doesn't necessarily mean they'll use Brown during the season. They might use Zach Moss. They might just use whichever running backs out there. But I do think it at least means that if it's a 2 running back committee, that's going to be a lot better than a 3 running back committees that we do see around the place at times. For me, Moss is still probably the starter, but Brown's certainly a name that is growing, even though he didn't look particularly good in this game. Jamar Chase was rested. T. Higgins obviously started. Trenton Irwin was there on the other side, while Andre Josefas was in the slot. And I feel like he is probably going to be the Tyler Boyd replacement. I feel like this is what this is suggesting. A lot of people have been thinking Jermaine Burton, and he did score a nice long touchdown, but that was from Logan Woodside. That was in the second half. He's well down. He's behind Jackson and Lassiter as well. So I do think that it is probably Chase, Higgins, and Josefas at the moment. Irwin is the key backup. He's a good blocking tight end as well. Wide receiver, I should say, as well. And Burton's got a lot of work to do. He does have the talent, but I think at this stage it is going to be Josefas who is the starter, and Burton can develop and prove that he's capable. So for now, in Dynasty, I think Josefas is a guy that is worth picking up because we have seen Tyler Boyd be reasonably productive at times. At tight end, Mike Gesicki was technically the starter, but Eric Hall's injured, so that doesn't necessarily mean a lot. Plus, he still saw a lot of Drew Sample blocking. There were some reports out last week, but talking up Mike Gesicki as like a mismatch weapon, as a guy that they think is going to be very useful for them this season. I still think we're going to see a lot of blocking guys involved, as we saw last season. I think this is going to remain an ugly committee situation. For the Bucs, they rested a lot of starters. Kyle Trask appears to be the backup at the moment. At running back, it's hard to tell exactly what's going on. The good news is that Bucky Irving was clearly ahead of Sean Tucker, but we expected that. It's whether he's ahead of Chase Edmonds that's interesting, and Edmonds is injured, so we don't know yet. Irving looked okay. He looked fine. He scored a touchdown at least. We'll have to wait until Edmonds is healthy to get a clear report on what's going on there. At running back, Jalen McMillan and Trey Palmer both played outside, which suggests to me that we're probably going to see a Chris Godwin in the slot situation this season, and that's great for Godwin's value. There's no clear leader out of McMillan and Palmer. Palmer was the slot guy for much of last season, but I do think that McMillan's probably already ahead of him. So I think it's probably Evans and McMillan on the outside, Godwin in the slot, but we will probably see a little bit of Palmer as well. They also just brought in Sterling Shepard. I think he's probably washed by now. He's in his 30s. I don't think that we're expecting him to be heavily involved. At tight end, Kate Otton's the clear guy, backed up by Payne Durham. Jaguars against Chiefs. The Jaguars started their starters and their proper starters. They started pretty much everybody. A couple of things jumped out. Firstly, unsurprisingly, Trevor Lawrence was the starter, but more surprisingly, Mac Jones was not number 2. It was CJ Beathard. Now, that doesn't mean that it will remain that way. That could just be a situation of seniority, the amount of time he's been at the team, Mac Jones learning the playbook, but I don't know. It does seem to me to be that Beathard is probably the key backup, which is a real fall from grace for Mac Jones that he's not even a backup now. For the running back, Travis Etienne was unsurprisingly the main guy, but then Tank Bigsby played well ahead of Dearness Johnson. It wasn't close. He played in all situations. This is not what I expected because Johnson was clearly the number 2 last season. We've heard negative reports about Bigsby in camp, so I don't know what's going on here, but it does seem like Bigsby is the clear handcuff at the moment. I would personally just be taking neither of these handcuffs. Plus, Keelan Robinson was injured, so we don't definitively know that he's behind those guys either. So Bigsby against Johnson is going to be the battle. I think that Bigsby probably ends up ahead of him based on this, but I would be taking neither of them. At wide receiver, the big concern was for Christian Kirk. We saw last season during the preseason that he wasn't used in 12 personnel. Then into the season, he wasn't used in 12 personnel. And then Zay Jones got injured and he broke out and started getting used more consistently. In this game, he wasn't used in 12 personnel. That's very bad news for Christian Kirk. I will be dropping him down my rankings, and it was very positive to see Brian Thomas Jr. already starting. He'll be moving up in the other direction. Gabe Davis remains Gabe Davis. He's not someone that you want outside best ball. The backups aren't particularly interesting. I don't know who has the value there. It's probably Parker Washington, but we saw Cooks and Duvernay kind of arguably play ahead of him, so it's a little bit confusing what's going on with the backups. At tight end, Evan Ingram's the clear number 1, but Luke Farrell did play with the starters, and Ingram came off the field a little bit more than expected. Now, that could have just been a preseason usage thing. I don't know, but it's just enough to be a little bit concerned about Ingram. So not sure exactly what to make of that, but just keep that in the back of your mind. For the Chiefs, Patrick Mahomes remains the starter. Carson Wentz appeared to be the backup. Nobody's surprised. For the running backs, Isaiah Pacheco, unsurprisingly, the starter. Then Clyde Edwards-Helaire came in. There were talks about Generic Prince running ahead of him, but it does appear to be Clyde, at least for now, though that could be a seniority thing, and it is possible that Prince will take over. The biggest surprise for me is they then used Carson Steele as their clear actual halfback, even though he's listed as a fullback on most depth charts I've seen. And they used him, probably even scored a touchdown. I don't know what was going on here, but they used him ahead of Keontae Ingram. They used him ahead of Louis Rees-Zammit, who I think quite a few of us were hoping to see good things from. So I'm not sure what to make of that situation. I can't imagine that Steele's suddenly someone we want for fantasy. He's probably just more of an inconvenience than anything else. I do think that Pacheco is the guy to own, but there is enough nerves for me with Generic Prince that I'm no longer willing to say that Edwards-Helaire is a good handcuff option. For the wide receivers, Marquise Brown caught the ball, got injured, immediately off. Shoulder dislocation or some sort of thing around the shoulder dislocated. I didn't understand the exact terminology. Regardless, he might be back to start the season, but the good news is that Xavier Worthy was clearly started. He and Rashee Rice will clearly be in there with Brown once Brown is healthy. But when Brown's not healthy, it does seem like Sky Moore is the replacement. Although Kadarius Toney is also injured, and so is Justin Watson. So it is possible that those guys will battle more once they're healthy. Then it was Mecole Hardman and Justin Ross. So look, there's three clear starters here. Rice, Brown, and Worthy. They're the guys you want for fantasy. Everyone else I would be avoiding. At tight end, Travis Kelce remains the starter, but Noel Gray was playing ahead of Jared Wiley. No surprises there. Titans against the 49ers. For the Titans, Will Levis, unsurprisingly, starting. We knew that Mason Rudolph was ahead of Malik Willis. Talked about that in the preseason news. For the running backs, Tony Pollard and Tyjae Spears were essentially used interchangeably. They kind of just moved one in for the other whenever they felt like it. So I do expect that that's going to remain a committee situation that's going to be really annoying for fantasy. I would not be picking up any of the backups in Tennessee, and you can probably drop Hassan Haskins if you still have him from last year. For the wide receivers, DeAndre Hopkins may miss the start of the season. If that happens, it will be Treylon Burks who comes in for him, though we did also see a little bit of Nick Westbrook-Akine in there as well. Calvin Ridley remains the main guy while Hopkins is out. Tyler Boyd will do some slot work, but he's not going to be out there enough in this offense to be useful. I'll probably be avoiding all of these wide receivers. I'm not really buying this situation. At tight end, Chika Okonkwo lost way too many snaps to Josh Wiley, and Nick Vannett was not even in there. So a little bit concerned about what's happening there. I was really high on Okonkwo going into last season. I thought we might see a Delaney Walker-style situation. Instead, we saw a current Delaney Walker situation of not being very useful at all. For the 49ers, lots of rested players, lots of injured players. We saw Brandon Allen going ahead of Josh Dobbs, which is a bit surprising. At running back, Jordan Mason was the guy because there was no Isaac Garendo. Cody Schrader coming in second was a bit of a surprise. I liked him in college. He was excellent at Missouri. I had him in college fantasy, but I did not expect him to make an impact in the NFL this soon. So it is possible that he makes the roster because he was playing ahead of some bigger names as the second guy out there. At wide receiver, we know that Brandon Ayuk remains wanting another contract. Talk about him going to the Steelers, but I do expect him to play for the 49ers this year. He'll play alongside Debo, who was rested. Ricky Pearsall and Juwan Jennings didn't play. Jacob Cowing is also injured, so there were a whole heap of just guys. I think Ronnie Bell's probably the next guy up there, but realistically, you don't want any of those wide receivers that are the top three. At tight end, George Kittle was rested. It was interesting to see what was going on behind him. It seemed to be Eric Sobert, although Braden Willis is still in there and Cameron Latu was injured for all of last season. It is possible that Latu eventually takes over from those two guys. I like Latu. I had him in college fantasy as well. For the Chargers, Justin Herbert, I've got him listed as rested. He's really injured. He's got plantar fasciitis. I've had that. It ain't fun. I would not want to play football with it. I think that's going to take him a little bit of time, but he should be back by the start of the season because you do not want an Eastern stick running this offense. The offense looked generally poor with all the other wide receivers. Admittedly, they rested plenty of other players as well. Speaking of wide receivers, Josh Palmer was out. Ladd McConkey was out. Both of them were rested. DJ Chark started on the outside. Semi Fehoko played in the slot, and Brendan Rice played in the Josh Palmer slot. Quinn Johnston didn't come on until DJ Chark was off. Now, that could mean that Johnston's all the way down at wide receiver 6, but I think it's probably more likely that they're just interchanging them based on position. They haven't really gotten people playing all different roles yet. So it might be that Johnston remains competing with Chark, but that Palmer's true replacement is Brendan Rice. But if there's an injury, we actually see Johnston slide in there, and they see Fehoko as the replacement slot guy. Either way, you don't want Quentin Johnston. You don't want DJ Chark. That's bad for both of them. Palmer and McConkey are the guys to own. Among the tight ends, it was also real ugly. Hayden Hurst is probably the guy to own, but I don't think he's playing enough snaps to be useful because Will Disley always gets paid even money and gets used an annoying amount. And Donald Parham will still be involved in certain situations as well. At running back, they rested Edwards and Dobbins, but I was surprised not to see Vidal play. I don't really know exactly what happened there. We know that Jared Patterson was playing ahead of him at times. He started from Elijah Dotson. And then Isaiah Spiller was behind that even, which is surprising. So I don't know what this means for Vidal, but I still don't want him for fantasy. For the Seahawks, Geno Smith rested. He has had some injuries, but he's back practicing. Sam Howell played and honestly looked pretty solid. For the running backs, Kenneth Walker was rested. Zach Charbonnet really only played the first 5 or 6 snaps. And then it was kind of Kenny McIntosh and George Holani kind of splitting those snaps a little bit, with McIntosh getting the main amount. You don't want anyone that's not Walker or Charbonnet of the running backs. At wide receiver, Metcalf and Lockett were rested, but Jackson Smith and Jigba wasn't. And he was kind of used in interesting situations, kind of used on every down, kind of moved around a little bit. It will be interesting to see if he gets a little bit more involved on 12 personnel, where we saw Metcalf and Lockett out there last season. It would be nice to see him getting a few more touches, but for me, he is still clearly the wide receiver 3 in this offense, and Jake Bobo is the key backup, as we saw last year. None of those other guys are of value. I do think that Noah Fant's going to become a lot more valuable in this offense this year. We didn't really see him used that way in the past, but I think that will be the case here. So I am feeling pretty good about what that is going to mean for Noah Fant. He is someone who's riding up my rankings. I'm not particularly scared off by Pharaoh Brown or Brady Russell, who's the tight end 3 now. Cardinals against the Saints. This is an interesting one. For the Cardinals, they rested some of their starters, but not all of them. Colin Murray was obviously out. We saw Desmond Ridder as the backup. I think Clayton Tune personally looked better myself, but it does seem that Ridder is the backup, even though we've seen what he can do. At running back, we know that James Conner's the guy, but what happens after that is interesting. There were reports that suggested that James Conner's backup is Trey Benson, but only for the early downs. And even when Conner's playing, Michael Carter is the receiving back. And that's exactly how it looked in this game. Trey Benson played the early downs. Michael Carter, even deeper into the game, played the receiving downs. There was no Amari Demicado, so it's possible he's battling with Carter for that receiving down work. But we saw even when Tony Jones came in, we still saw a little bit of Carter on receiving down. So the weirdest thing is that Carter didn't actually get any receiving action, but he was still out there on those downs. So I'm not really sure what's going on there. Carter did also play a stint of first downs before they brought Jones out after they put Trey Benson away. So Benson is ahead of Carter. It's just that Carter seems to be playing as more of a role player at the moment. For the wide receivers, Marvin Harrison Jr. got a little bit of action, but not a lot, didn't get a target. We saw that Michael Wilson was rested. Zay Jones still a little bit injured, same with Greg Dortch. So it was a lot of the lower down guys. You don't need to worry about those guys. It is Harrison's the guy you want. Wilson will probably start with Zay Jones, but we might see Greg Dortch involved if they need a slot guy. Trey McBride, unsurprisingly, rested. Obviously, they drafted Tip Ryman in the 3rd round. They're using him as a blocking tight end. No surprises there. And he actually looked okay. Elijah Higgins will be the receiving tight end there, and he played a few snaps with the starters as well. For New Orleans, Derek Carr remains the main guy, even though he didn't look spectacular. Jake Hayner was ahead of Spencer Rattler, but that doesn't necessarily mean much at this stage of the season, even though Hayner did look the better of the two. Alvin Kamara's played a few snaps early on before Jamal Williams took over. Obviously, there's no Kendra Miller at the moment, so we saw guys like Jordan Mims and James Robinson come in. At wide receiver, there was no Rashid Shaheed, so instead we saw Kevin Austin come in the slot. We didn't see A.T. Perry. We saw Austin and we saw Cedric Wilson. I think Wilson's probably the wide receiver 3 at this stage. I think we hoped it would be Perry, but it does seem to be Wilson now. So that would mean it would be Olave, Shaheed, and Wilson. We might even see a little bit of Kevin Austin if they need a slot guy out there, which is surprising. A.T. Perry did make one particularly nice catch, and it is possible that he will fight his way forward, but it does seem to be ordered that way at the moment. Juwan Johnson is injured. We saw Taysom Hill out there doing a whole heap of random stuff as usual, but not a lot of it. Foster Moreau was the main actual tight end. I think they probably still have a starting tight end in Johnson, but he's not someone you particularly want for fantasy. Colts against the Broncos is a high-scoring game. The Colts used like 5 quarterbacks. It was very strange. Anthony Richardson obviously started. Then Joe Flacco got involved. Then Sam Ellinger got involved. So they're doing a bit of everything. They started most of their starters, or at least the healthy ones. Jonathan Taylor was out there, but not for long. Trey Sermon then got himself injured, which was not particularly helpful at all. Tyler Goodson then came in, and he seemed to be the clear replacement for Sermon. Evan Hull's behind him, and he didn't look great, even though Goodson and Hull scored touchdowns. It was a pretty messy game. I do think that Sermon remains the backup you want if he's healthy, and we don't know that he is at this stage. At wide receiver, obviously Michael Pittman is the guy. Josh Downs got injured, and Adonai Mitchell got moved to the slot as a result. I don't know if he ordinarily would have been playing on the outside ahead of Alec Pierce, but Pierce was out there with the starters and being used as a starter. We've seen that Pierce isn't valuable for fantasy, but he is annoying enough to get in the way of when they're going to use Mitchell. So if Downs is out for a while, and I think he might miss the first couple of games potentially, that might help Mitchell get involved and then take over that role from Pierce once Downs comes out. Anthony Gould, who I thought was just going to be a special teamer, was actually involved as the next slot guy, which surprised me. And then you start bringing in guys like your DJ Montgomerys and your Ashton Doolans. At tight end, I think we all expected Jelani Woods to take over that lead role, but it wasn't. It was Kylan Granson and Mo Ali Cox. We even saw some Andrew Ogletree and Will Mallory start to get involved not that long after Jelani Woods. So this remains a total mess. I don't want any of these Colts tight ends. For the Broncos, Jarrett Stidham got the start. Hard to tell how much of that is seniority and how much is actually intent. Bo Nix was certainly out there for a lot longer, and he looked pretty good. At running back, a bit of a surprise. Javonte Williams played as the key lead every down guy. Samaje Perine was out there, but he was very much the third down back. It was Williams the whole time. They didn't even really bring in Jaleel McLaughlin much until he just took over permanently from Williams. And then we saw Audric Estime come in after that. So I'm not really sure exactly what's happening here, but it does seem to be Williams, then McLaughlin as the change of pace back, then Estime as the backup, with Perine as the third down back. It's going to be ugly for all involved, but it does seem that Williams is the guy to own. I still don't particularly want him. At wide receiver, there was a surprise. I was joking in the last recording we did on the preseason news about Tim Patrick being down as the starting wide receiver. But they played him as starting wide receiver here. They're clearly using him this way, and this really surprises me. I thought that Josh Reynolds was going to be the number 2 guy. He was out there, but not in 12 personnel. It was Patrick that was playing every down. So not sure what to make of this. I don't feel great about it. It's a guy that hasn't played for a couple of years, and he's not exactly explosive. He's over 30. I mean, I know he's been reliable, but he's not someone you want for fantasy particularly. But this really hurts Josh Reynolds' value. Marvin Mims Jr. played like the first snap and then hardly at all until like late first quarter, early second quarter. So don't feel great about that situation, even though he scored a touchdown. Lil Jordan Humphrey and Devon Vele were out there before we even saw Troy Franklin. I do think Franklin will naturally rise, but it's kind of hard to see him being someone who's going to be useful for fantasy in the near future. For the tight ends, it was Dulcich and Troutman remaining in that weird kind of committee situation where Troutman does a lot of the blocking work and then Dulcich gets involved in 11 personnel and does a whole heap of receiving work. Lucas Krull was also involved before the starters left, and we did hear that he was going to be a little bit involved and might even take over from Dulcich. Seems like he hasn't taken over, but he's certainly involved enough to be inconvenient, and he had 4 receptions for 31 yards as well. Finally, Rams against the Cowboys. Lots of players rested, and they basically used the starters the whole time. Stetson Bennett played the whole game for some reason and threw 4 interceptions. He did not look great. They rested Williams and Corum, which was interesting. Boston Scott and Zach Evans were the main guys. Scott started ahead of Evans. You don't want either of those guys. Corum is the guy you want as the Williams backup. At wide receiver, they rested the top 4 wide receivers, which meant Whittington and Smith got involved. We did see that that Nakua got involved in the first game last preseason, so it is possible that Whittington will be involved. I don't even know much about Xavier Smith. Tyler Johnson's not someone who interests me. Even in this game, he wasn't being used in anything other than 11 personnel. At tight end, Tyler Higbee is injured. Colby Parkinson is the clear starter. Davis Allen and Hunter Long are fighting for scraps. For the Cowboys, plenty of rested players. Cooper Rush started ahead of Trey Lance, but Lance played most of the game. At running back, Zeke was rested. Royce Freeman was injured, so even though Rico Dowdle started, that doesn't necessarily mean a lot. Juice Vaughn is even injured, so all we know is that Dowdle's ahead of Malik Davis. That doesn't tell us a lot. We would really be nice to have Royce Freeman back and Zeke actually playing, so we know where Dowdle sits. At wide receiver, CeeDee Lamb remains holding out. That's a whole mess that I'll talk about in preseason news when that happens. Cooks and Tolbert were also rested, so they're clearly the starters. Jalen Brooks appears to be the next guy up. Jalen Cropper's kind of the receiving guy, but he did get involved. Don't even know who Tyron Billy Johnson is. He was just the next guy up as well. At tight end, Jake Ferguson was rested. Luke Schoonmaker has moved ahead of Peyton Hendershot. Even Princeton Fant was playing against both of these guys. I think he's a former Seahawks player. So that was a bit of a weird one. But realistically, Jake Ferguson's still the guy to own. Finally, if your drafts are coming up, and that was a whole lot of information, you just don't know what to do with it, let me help you out. Your league has very specific settings that are not going to be catered for by most sets of rankings on the internet. So let me help you out. I will personalize rankings to your individual settings. Over half the people I did this for last year have come back and asked for it again. So clearly it's working. It's something that people have enjoyed using. I hope that you'll join in and get involved as well. Email me at benwasley23@gmail.com. I can just talk you through how it works. And if you're not interested, that's totally okay as well. Now, if you are interested in seeing more from the Fantasy First Down, please make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube. You can also check us out on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down, on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. And you can also check out our rankings at ffdfantasyfootball.com. My articles are at football.razzball.com. Plus, if you'd like to play with us in a league, you should also check out my Instagram account where I'll have a lot of competitions coming up in the next week to play in the FFD League. It's the third year we're doing it. It's been very fun for all involved the first 2 years, so I hope you will get involved in that as well. For now, though, that's all for me. I'll be back in the next few days to talk about some preseason news and stuff coming out of training camps, injuries, and other contract stuff and depth chart reports. Plus, I'll also be talking about the wide receiver and tight end, what to expect from our rookies series as well. That'll all come out before the season starts as well. Good luck in your drafts, and I hope to see you soon.